In part 2 of our video series involving the regulation of the male reproductive system, we're going to talk about the series of hormones that are used to regulate the production of both sperm and testosterone in the testes. In order to understand this, we need to go all the way back to the beginning of when the male reproductive system becomes active, which of course is puberty, which is the scientific word for the period of time that corresponds to sexual maturation, not just in males, but also in females. Now, this period is a little bit unusual because in terms of the stimulus that starts the whole idea of puberty, we don't actually know what this is. Once the process begins, however, it's a relatively straightforward process to understand, but in terms of the root cause that stimulates sexual maturation in both males and females, this remains as yet undiscovered. What we do know is that this process typically begins when a male reaches the ages of between 10 and 14. Now, at this time, one of the most important regulatory centers in the bottom of the brain, a section that we call the hypothalamus, becomes active and starts producing a key regulatory hormone with an unfortunately rather cumbersome name to try and remember, and that is gonadotropin releasing hormone. If you don't want to say gonadotropin releasing hormone every single time we refer to this, we can simply refer to this as gonadotropin becomes GN, releasing, R, and hormone, H. So, the job of the hypothalamus is to produce GnRH, and GnRH has a relatively simple job. Its job is to move to one of the most important hormonal regulatory glands in the body, a gland that we call the pituitary gland, and tell the pituitary gland to become active and make 2 additional hormones, which in turn will directly affect the testes and affect sperm and testosterone production. Those hormones also have rather cumbersome names to remember, the first of which is what we call follicle-stimulating hormone, and the second one is what we call luteinizing hormone. These names don't really make any sense and don't really refer to anything that seems familiar because the names that they reference, follicle and luteinizing, actually refer to the female reproductive system because they were discovered in females first and their role in the male reproductive system was discovered after. Now, just like with GnRH, we can shorten these names to make them easier to say. So follicle-stimulating hormone is what we will call FSH, and luteinizing hormone is simply referred to as LH. Now, once the pituitary gland has produced both FSH and LH, eventually they need to make it down to the testes where the action is taking place. Now, obviously, because the pituitary gland is nowhere near the testes, FSH and LH need to be transported to the testes using the blood and allowing our circulatory system to take them where they need to go. Now, once FSH and LH reach the testes, each of them is going to affect the different types of cell tissues that we looked at in the previous video. So we're going to look at FSH first because FSH is the hormone that stimulates the seminiferous tubules, that being the large networks of tubes that are found on the inside of the testes, and this is important because these are the cells where spermatogenesis occurs. So from this, we can conclude that FSH is responsible for triggering the production of sperm that occurs here. Of course, FSH is not enough to do this because the sperm that are produced in the seminiferous tubules are not yet mature and not able to move outside of the testes on their own, which is why we need LH to affect the interstitial cells. So remember that the interstitial cells are the cells that are found in the layers of tissue in between the seminiferous tubules, and the interstitial cells are responsible for producing the primary male sex hormone, testosterone, and this is necessary in reproduction because sperm need testosterone in order to trigger the physical changes in their structure to allow them to become fully mature and be able to navigate and move independently outside of the testes. Now that we've finished looking at the overall process behind how this regulation takes place, it's time to actually look at the built-in shutoff system that the male reproductive system has within its own hormone pathway. Now, if we follow the pathway of this hormone, we see again it begins in the hypothalamus, which releases GnRH to stimulate the pituitary gland to release LH and FSH to trigger testosterone and sperm production respectively. The point is, eventually, the effects of GnRH will result in the concentration of testosterone increasing. Now, the higher the concentration of testosterone gets, eventually this hormone is going to end up back in the blood because testosterone actually causes a large number of effects throughout the male body. And eventually, this hormone will be able to make it all the way back to the hypothalamus, again via the circulatory system. And when it makes it back to the hypothalamus, testosterone is actually able to bind to receptor proteins found within the hypothalamus, which will trigger the inhibition of GnRH production. What this means is that if no GnRH is produced, the pituitary gland loses its activity, meaning that LH and FSH production are shut down, and therefore testosterone production by the testicular interstitial cells also shuts down. What this means is the more testosterone is present, the more likely it will be able to make it back to the hypothalamus and shut down the production of GnRH, concluding that testosterone is more likely to inhibit its own production, making this a very clear example of negative feedback or simply feedback inhibition. Now, when learning about homeostatic regulatory pathways, it helps to keep all of the information organized, especially in pathways that involve multiple hormones such as this. Now, typically, a feedback pathway will begin with a stimulus, but as we've previously discussed, the stimulus for triggering puberty remains as yet unknown. However, everything else is relatively easy to identify. We know that the organ that is responsible for sensing the balance of testosterone is the hypothalamus. And because the hypothalamus produces our first regulatory hormone, GnRH, which is central to the rest of this process happening, we can also think of the hypothalamus as the primary control center for this entire regulatory cycle. Now, even though the pituitary gland is the next gland that is affected by GnRH, it is not the actual primary location that we want to affect, because our goal, the response of this pathway, is to produce sperm to allow our male to be able to reproduce, and also to produce testosterone for the purpose of triggering sexual maturation and also helping sperm to mature. Therefore, the effector organ, the organ that actually causes this response, would instead be considered the testes. And once we figure negative feedback into this, the idea that testosterone actually has the ability to shut down the control center, the hypothalamus, in order to inhibit this process, we now have a relatively complete and succinct picture, as long as we include all of the regulatory hormones in here, of how the male reproductive system is regulated. In the final video in the series, we're going to look specifically at the effects of testosterone in order to look at the possible consequences of what happens when the testosterone regulatory pathway is broken or doesn't function properly.